December the 2nd, 1993. Gustavo Escobar had been Pablo's blood for 37 years. The cousin who taught him to shoot, who helped him build an empire. That's exactly why the DEA paid Carlos Mendoza to convince Gustavo to give up Pablo's location. Carlos handed Gustavo the briefcase, $30,000. Gustavo opened it, looked at the money, then closed it again. "Tell your American friends," Gustavo said. "That blood doesn't have a price." 24 hours later, Pablo held a glass of cyanide to his cousin's lips. The whole cartel watched, and Carlos Mendoza realized he'd just gotten an innocent man killed for information Gustavo never gave. For 30 years, Carlos carried that secret. Until yesterday, when Gustavo's daughter walked into his cafe and placed the same briefcase on his table. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The woman across from him had her father's eyes dark, calculating, patient. But where Pablo Escobar's gaze had burned with violence, hers held something worse, justice. "You recognize it, don't you?" she said, her voice carrying the precise diction of someone who'd spent years in courtrooms. "The same case you brought to my uncle's house in December 1993. Carlos's cafe had emptied an hour ago, the last tourist couple wandering back toward the old city walls of Cartagena. The ceiling fan clicked overhead, stirring the humid air that never quite cooled, even after sunset. 15 years he'd served coffee and empanadas in this place. 15 years of ordinary mornings, predictable customers, and the gentle rhythm of a life deliberately small. "I think you have me confused with someone else, señorita." She smiled, a prosecutor's smile that said she'd heard better lies from drunk teenagers. "Carmen Escobar, federal prosecutor, Organized Crime Division. And you're Carlos Mendoza, formerly DEA, operative ID number 7743. You bought this cafe in 2008 with cash. You live alone in the apartment upstairs. You close every day at 6 except Sundays when you close at 4. You haven't left Cartagena in 7 years. The surveillance details hit like physical blows. Someone had been watching him. For how long? And why surface now? Carlos forced himself to lean back, affecting the casual indifference of a man with nothing to hide. "Sounds like you know more about my life than I do. What do you want?" Carmen opened the briefcase. Not money this time, photographs. Black and white, grainy, but clear enough. The first showed Carlos younger, leaner, standing in a parking garage with a man who looked like Pablo Escobar if you squinted. The second captured a briefcase exchange. The third, Carlos's blood turned to ice water. Pablo Escobar forcing a glass to his cousin's lips while a circle of cartel members watched. And there, in the background, barely visible in the shadows, Carlos himself. $30,000, Carmen said. "That's what the DEA paid you to turn my uncle against my father. That's what his life was worth to your government." The words stuck in Carlos's throat like broken glass. How could he explain that Gustavo had refused the money? That he'd died for nothing for loyalty Pablo never believed he possessed? That Carlos had spent 3 decades drowning in guilt over a betrayal that never happened? "Your uncle was a drug trafficker," he managed. "He made his choices. My uncle was murdered because you convinced my father he was a traitor." Carmen's composure cracked just enough to let rage bleed through. "I've spent 15 years building this case. 15 years tracking down everyone who was there that night. Most are dead now. Convenient deaths, car accidents, heart attacks, random street crime." She pulled out another photograph, recent, taken with a telephoto lens. Carlos leaving his cafe, keys in hand, unaware he was being watched. "But you're still here, aren't you? Still alive, still free. That seems unusual." The implication hung in the air like poison gas. In the cartel's world, loose ends didn't survive 15 years. If Carlos was still breathing, it meant someone wanted him that way. But who and why? "What is it you think I can give you?" "Because why else would my father have killed him? Pablo didn't murder family without cause." Carlos almost laughed at the naivety. Pablo Escobar had killed for paranoia, for sport, for the simple pleasure of watching fear bloom in a man's eyes. But Carmen had constructed a different mythology, one where her father's violence followed rational patterns, where every death served justice in some twisted form. "Your father killed people for looking at him wrong," Carlos said quietly. "You were too young to remember, but the rest of us lived through it." Something flickered across her face pain, quickly suppressed. She gathered the photographs with sharp, efficient movements, but Carlos noticed she avoided looking at the execution shot again. Outside, a motorcycle backfired in the distance, the sound ricocheting off colonial walls like gunfire. Both of them flinched. Carmen's hand moved instinctively toward her purse, a prosecutor who'd learned to go armed, Carlos realized. Another sign of the violence that still threaded through this country like a persistent fever. The cafe felt smaller now, intimate in a way that made Carlos uncomfortable. The familiar space, his refuge for 15 years, had become a confessional booth. The espresso machine gleamed in the corner, its copper pipes catching the light. Tomorrow morning, if there was a tomorrow morning, he'd fire it up at 5:30 and begin grinding beans for the breakfast crowd. Tourists wanting their caffeine fix before exploring the old fortifications. Local businessmen grabbing cortados on their way to offices in the financial district. Simple transactions, predictable rhythms, a life deliberately emptied of consequence. But sitting across from Carmen Escobar, watching her struggle with doubts she couldn't quite articulate, Carlos felt the weight of all the people who depended on those rhythms. Mercedes, who worked the morning shift and supported 3 grandchildren on her waitress wages. Old Miguel, who came in every Tuesday for coffee and chess, marking time until his pension check arrived. The college students who treated his cafe like a library, nursing single cups for hours while they studied for law exams. What would happen to them when the violence found its way back to his door? "There's something else," Carmen said, her voice softer now. "Something I haven't told you." Carlos waited. In his DEA years, he'd learned that the most dangerous information always came after the first ultimatum, when people thought they'd already revealed their worst cards. "My uncle had a daughter, Elena. She was 15 when he died." Carmen's fingers traced the edge of the briefcase. "She contacted me 6 months ago, said she had something that belonged to her father, something he'd hidden." The air in the cafe seemed to thicken. Carlos could hear his own heartbeat, steady but too fast. What kind of something? Records, financial records. Names and dates and bank account numbers from the early 90s. Carmen leaned forward, and Carlos caught a whiff of expensive perfume mixed with something sharper, fear maybe, or anticipation. Including a record of a $30,000 deposit that never happened. The world tilted sideways. Carlos gripped the edge of the table, feeling the smooth wood grain under his fingertips like an anchor to reality. If Gustavo had kept records, if he'd documented the money he'd been offered but never taken. Where is this girl now? Dead. The word fell flat, final. Car accident in Medellin 3 weeks after she contacted me. Very convenient timing. Carlos closed his eyes, seeing another ghost join the procession that haunted his nights. A 15-year-old girl becoming a middle-aged woman, carrying her father's secrets like inherited jewelry. Dying because she'd tried to set the record straight. But before the accident, Carmen continued, she made copies, sent them to someone she trusted, someone who knew her father personally. The implication hit like cold water. She sent them to me. Did she? Carlos thought about the mail that had been piling up in his apartment. Bills, advertisements, the occasional postcard from tourists who'd promised to keep in touch. He'd been avoiding the climb upstairs, avoiding the solitude where memories grew sharp enough to cut. "I don't know," he admitted. I don't check my mail regularly." Carmen stood, smoothing her skirt with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. "Then I suggest you do, tonight. Because if those records exist, if they prove my uncle never took your money, then everything changes." She paused at the door, silhouetted against the amber streetlight. "And Mr. Mendoza, if those records surface, you won't be the only one in danger. Elena trusted someone else with copies. Someone who's been waiting 30 years for the right moment to use them." The door chimed as she left, the sound echoing in the empty cafe like a funeral bell. The walk upstairs to his apartment had never felt longer. Each step on the narrow wooden staircase creaked under his weight, sounds he'd stopped noticing years ago now loud as gunshots in the silence. His keys rattled against the lock. When had his hands started trembling like an old man's? The apartment was exactly as he'd left it that morning. Spartan, functional, deliberately empty of anything that might trigger memories. A single bed, a kitchen table for one, shelves lined with books about coffee cultivation and Colombian history-safe subjects that lived entirely in the present. The only photograph in the room showed the cafe on opening day, Mercedes beaming beside the espresso machine they'd spent 3 days learning to operate. The mail sat in a wicker basket by the door, exactly where the building's manager had been leaving it for the past month. Carlos had stopped retrieving it from the lobby mailbox after the 3rd notice from his insurance company. Bills could wait. Advertisements went straight to the trash. and anything important would find another way to reach him. Now he dumped the entire contents onto his kitchen table, paper cascading across the scarred wooden surface. Electric bills, water bills, flyers for a new restaurant in Gethsemane, a postcard from a German couple who'd spent 2 weeks at his corner table last spring, writing that they missed his empanadas, 3 different credit card offers, and there, near the bottom of the pile, a manila envelope with no return address. His name written in careful block letters, the kind of handwriting taught in Colombian schools 40 years ago. The postmark read, Medellin, dated 6 weeks ago. Elena Restrepo, Gustavo's daughter, would have learned to write her letters exactly like that. Carlos's finger traced the edge of the envelope. Such a small thing to contain the power to rewrite 3 decades of guilt. Inside could be proof that Gustavo had died for loyalty, not betrayal. Or it could be something worse, evidence that would paint an even bigger target on Carlos's back. The envelope opened with a soft tear. Inside, a single sheet of paper wrapped around a small key, the kind used for safety deposit boxes. The letter was brief, written in the same careful handwriting. Mr. Mendoza, my father, kept records of everything. Bank deposits that never came, meetings that never happened, names of people who lied about him after he died. I have been waiting 29 years to find someone brave enough to tell the truth. The key opens box 247 at Banco Central Cartagena branch. Go tomorrow morning at opening time. Come alone. If you are reading this, I am probably dead, but my father's name deserves better than the lies they buried him with. Elena Restrepo. The paper slipped from Carlos's numb fingers, floating to the floor like a white flag of surrender. 30 years of carefully constructed isolation, shattered by a dead woman's final gamble. Elena had trusted him, a stranger, a man whose actions had led to her father's execution, to set the record straight. The irony cut deep enough to draw blood. The DEA had taught him to disappear, to become invisible, to shed identities like old clothes. He'd mastered every technique for vanishing completely. But you couldn't disappear from the truth. It followed you across decades, patient as cancer, waiting for the right moment to surface and metastasize through your carefully ordered life. Carlos walked to his window, looking down at the cafe's dark interior. In 8 hours, he'd flip the lights on and start the coffee machines. Mercedes would arrive with stories about her grandchildren's school troubles. Miguel would shuffle in for his Tuesday chess game, moving pieces with arthritic fingers while complaining about the government. Normal life. Safe life. The life of a man who'd paid his debts and earned his peace. But the key felt warm in his palm, and he knew that life was over. Tomorrow morning at opening time, he'd walk into Banco Central and retrieve whatever Elena Restrepo had died to preserve. The records would either vindicate Gustavo's memory or reveal some deeper conspiracy that had kept Carlos alive all these years when everyone else was dying. Either way, there would be no going back to the safety of routine. The past had finally caught up with him, delivered by a dead woman's careful handwriting and a prosecutor's desperate need for justice. Carlos closed his fist around the key and felt 15 years of peace crumble like old concrete. Whatever waited in that safety deposit box would change everything, not just what he knew about Gustavo's death, but what it meant that Carlos Mendoza was still alive to learn it. At 5:15, he gave up waiting and headed downstairs to open the cafe early. The familiar ritual might steady his nerves, grinding beans, firing up the espresso machine, arranging pastries in the display case. But his hands shook as he measured coffee, spilling grounds across the counter in dark scatter patterns that looked ominously like blood spatter. Mercedes arrived at her usual time, keys jingling as she unlocked the door to find him already elbow-deep in preparation. "Ay, Carlos, you look terrible." She hung her purse behind the counter and tied her apron with practiced efficiency. "Didn't sleep? Just restless." He avoided her eyes, focusing instead on the temperamental espresso machine that required coaxing each morning. Nothing serious, but Mercedes had worked for him long enough to read the subtle signs of distress, the way he moved too quickly, the unusual precision with which he arranged the sugar dispensers. She studied him with the practiced concern of a woman who'd raised 5 children and buried one husband. "Is someone bothering you?" Her voice dropped to the careful whisper reserved for dangerous subjects. "Someone from before?" Carlos's hands stilled on the coffee grinder. Mercedes knew pieces of his history enough to understand that he'd once lived a different kind of life, one that occasionally cast shadows into their peaceful present. She'd never asked direct questions, but her protective instincts had always been finely tuned. "Just old business," he said. "Nothing for you to worry about." Her frown deepened. "Carlos, you know what happened to Señor Ruiz last month?" The reference made his stomach clench. Ruiz had run a small electronics shop 3 blocks away, a quiet man who minded his own business and closed punctually at 6 every evening. Then one morning his shop hadn't opened, and by afternoon the neighborhood had learned about the robbery that left him dead in his storage room. Except nothing had been stolen, and the bullet wounds were too precise, too professional. "That was random," Carlos said automatically. "Wrong place, wrong time." Mercedes shook her head with the sad wisdom of someone who'd lived through decades of Colombian violence. "Men like Ruiz don't have random accidents, not in that way." She moved closer, lowering her voice further. "Yesterday, after you closed, a man came asking questions, said he was looking for an old friend named Carlos, wanted to know your schedule, whether you lived alone." Carlos's blood turned to ice water. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing. I told him we had 3 different Carlos who worked in this area, and he'd have to be more specific." Her eyes held the steel of someone protecting her own, but he didn't believe me. He sat across the street for 2 hours watching the cafe. The morning crowd began trickling in, early commuters grabbing coffee before the bus routes clogged with traffic. Carlos served them mechanically, his mind racing through implications. Someone was making inquiries. Someone knew where to find him. His 15 years of invisibility had finally expired. Miguel shuffled through the door at his usual time, but instead of heading to his corner table with the chess set, he approached the counter directly. His weathered face carried an expression Carlos had never seen before, not quite fear, but something close to it. "Carlos, my friend, I need to speak with you." The old man's voice carried unusual urgency, privately. They moved to the back of the cafe, near the window that overlooked the narrow alley where delivery trucks unloaded supplies. "Last night," Miguel began, "my nephew visited. He works for the Municipal Police Traffic Division, nothing important, but he heard something that made him nervous." Carlos waited, watching Miguel's arthritic fingers worry the edge of his newspaper. "There's been inquiries, official ones, about residents in this neighborhood who might have irregular backgrounds, people asking about documentation, employment history, who pays their bills in cash." Miguel's eyes met his directly. "Your name came up." The walls of the cafe seemed to close in. Official inquiries meant government involvement. But which government? Colombian authorities acting on a prosecutor's request, or something darker, the kind of investigation that ended with convenient accidents and closed files? "Miguel," Carlos said carefully, "if someone asks you about me—" "I know nothing," the old man interrupted. "I'm just a pensioner who plays chess and complains about politicians. My memory isn't what it used to be." But as Miguel spoke, Carlos noticed something that chilled him more than any direct threat. The old man's eyes kept drifting toward the street, scanning for watchers with the practiced caution of someone who'd learned to survive by staying invisible. Even his most innocent relationships were contaminated now. The violence was seeping back into his life like water through a cracked foundation, and everyone around him could feel it coming. The bank opened in 30 minutes. Whatever Elena Restrepo had preserved in that safety deposit box, Carlos was running out of time to retrieve it safely. The walk to Banco Central stretched across 4 blocks that might as well have been 4 countries. Every face in the crowd could be a watcher. Every parked motorcycle might carry someone with orders to follow him. The key burned in his pocket like a live coal, evidence of intentions he couldn't disguise. The bank's colonial facade projected stability, thick limestone walls that had weathered 3 centuries of war, revolution, and narco-violence. Inside, the air conditioning hummed with artificial calm, while security cameras tracked his movement across marble floors worn smooth by decades of desperate transactions. "Box 247, he told the clerk, producing Elena's key alongside identification that had protected his anonymity for 15 years. The safety deposit vault felt like a mausoleum. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as the clerk led him between rows of metal boxes, each one containing somebody's secrets. How many held evidence of old crimes? How many protected the last words of dead people? Box 247 sat at eye level, unremarkable among hundreds of identical compartments. The key turned smoothly. Elena had maintained the account religiously, paying fees from beyond the grave through automatic transfers. Inside, a thick manila folder and something wrapped in oilcloth. Carlos carried both items to the privacy booth, hands trembling as he spread the contents across the small table. Elena had been thorough. Bank statements showing no deposit on the date, Carlos remembered handing over $30,000. Hotel receipts proving Gustavo was in Cartagena when he supposedly met with DEA contacts in Bogotá. Phone records documenting calls that never happened, but the wrapped object made Carlos's vision blur. A small cassette recorder, the kind journalists used for interviews. A yellow sticky note in Elena's handwriting, my father's insurance policy. He recorded everything. Carlos stared at the machine, paralyzed by the implications. If Gustavo had recorded their conversations, if he documented the money being offered and refused. The booth felt like a coffin. Carlos pressed play with a finger that shook like a leaf in wind. Static, then voices. His own first younger, desperate. 30,000 Gustavo, American dollars. All you have to do is confirm his location. Then Gustavo's voice, patient and sad. Carlos, you don't understand. Pablo isn't just my cousin, he's family, real family, the kind that doesn't break. This is your chance to get out, take the money, disappear, start over somewhere safe. Where is safe for a man who betrays family? Mexico, Venezuela? You think 30,000 buys a new life? A long pause, then Carlos, you're a good man caught in a bad situation, but I won't be the one to solve it for you. Then what am I supposed to do? My supervisors are expecting results. They're threatening to pull me out, send someone else, someone who won't worry about collateral damage. Tell them whatever you need to tell them, but the money stays with you. The recording continued for 12 more minutes, Carlos begging, Gustavo refusing, gently but absolutely. A man choosing death over dishonor while Carlos painted elaborate pictures of the life he could build with blood money. The final exchange cut deepest. Gustavo, if I can't deliver Pablo's location, people are going to die. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but this war doesn't end until he's gone. Then that's God's decision, not ours, but I won't be the one to make it. Static. End of recording. Carlos ejected the cassette with numb fingers, 30 years of guilt reshaping itself into something worse. Gustavo had died because someone Carlos never identified, had provided Pablo's location. The money had been irrelevant. The betrayal had come from within Pablo's inner circle, but not from family, which meant Gustavo's execution had been pure paranoia. Pablo, surrounded by enemies and sensing walls closing in, had turned on the one person who'd remained loyal. Carlos's offer of money had simply provided a convenient excuse, a rational explanation for inevitable violence. Elena's final document was a handwritten letter, addressed to no one. Whoever reads this, my father died because Pablo Escobar couldn't trust anyone, not even innocent people. The American who tried to buy him has lived 30 years thinking he caused my father's death. But guilt belongs to the person who actually betrayed Pablo, someone who took no money, left no evidence, and disappeared completely after Pablo's death. Find that person, and you'll understand why everyone else had to die. Carlos packed the documents with mechanical precision, his mind struggling to process the magnitude of his delusion. 30 years of exile, 30 years of avoiding mirrors and meaningful relationships, 30 years of penance for a crime he hadn't committed. But understanding brought no relief, only deeper terror. If someone else had betrayed Pablo, and if that person had spent decades eliminating witnesses, then Elena's death hadn't been random, and Carlos's survival hadn't been luck. Someone had been keeping him alive for 30 years. The question was why? But why keep him alive? Why let him suffer when a single bullet would have been cleaner, more final? The answer came with a clarity that made his stomach revolt. Carlos wasn't a survivor. He was a scapegoat. Someone had needed Pablo's cousin dead to eliminate a witness, and Carlos had provided the perfect cover story. A grief-stricken DEA operative fleeing to Colombia, consumed by guilt over an innocent man's execution. Who would look deeper? Who would question the narrative of American guilt and Colombian betrayal? Carlos packed Elena's evidence with mechanical precision, but his hands moved too quickly, betraying the panic building in his chest. He'd been living someone else's lie. For 30 years he'd been the unwitting star of an elaborate performance, his exile providing cover for the real killer to disappear completely. The bank's marble floors echoed his footsteps as he walked toward the exit, each step carrying him further from the safety of ignorance. Outside, Cartagena's afternoon heat hit him like a physical blow, but the sweat on his forehead had nothing to do with temperature. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, Time to come home, Carlos. Your performance has been flawless. The words hit him like a physical blow. Performance. As if his guilt, his exile, his carefully constructed penance had all been theater, as if someone had been watching from the audience, applauding his dedication to a role he'd never known he was playing. Carlos's hands shook as he typed back, "Who is this?" The response came immediately, "Someone who's been very proud of your commitment to the part. Meet me at the Morales at sunset. Come alone, and bring Elena's evidence. It's time for your final scene." The phone slipped from Carlos's nerveless fingers, clattering on the sidewalk. A final scene, the language of theater, of performances that eventually had to end. He'd been kept alive not out of mercy, but because his suffering served a purpose. His guilt had been someone's shield, his exile their perfect alibi. But who had he been protecting all these years? Carlos retrieved his phone and walked toward the old city walls, his mind racing through possibilities. Someone close enough to Pablo's inner circle to know about Gustavo's loyalty. Someone with access to DEA operations to learn about Carlos's recruitment attempt. Someone who could disappear completely after Pablo's death while Carlos fled to Colombia, carrying the perfect cover story. The afternoon crowd parted around him as he walked, tourists photographing colonial architecture, vendors selling fruit from wooden carts, children playing soccer in narrow streets. Normal life continuing while his world collapsed into something unrecognizable. At the Morales, the ancient stone walls rose against a sky painted orange by the approaching sunset. Carlos found a bench facing the Caribbean, Elena's evidence folder heavy in his hands. The irony wasn't lost on him meeting his puppet master in the same spot where Spanish conquistadors had once planned their own schemes of conquest and betrayal. "Carlos Mendoza, you look exactly like I imagined." The voice came from behind him, accented English with traces of American education. Carlos turned slowly, dreading confirmation of a suspicion that had been building since he'd read Elena's final letter. The woman approaching was perhaps 50, professionally dressed, with the kind of understated authority that came from years in government service. She moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to controlling situations, to making decisions that affected other people's lives. "Agent Patricia Morrison," she said, settling onto the bench beside him. "DEA retired. Your former supervisor's supervisor, though we never met officially." Carlos stared at her, pieces clicking into place with sickening precision. Morrison had been part of the operation planning. She'd had access to all the intelligence, all the contact networks. She'd known about his approach to Gustavo before it happened. "You were Pablo's source," he said quietly. "You fed him information about DEA operations, about raids, about informants." Morrison's smile was thin and satisfied. "For 7 years, very profitably. But Pablo was becoming paranoid, suspicious of everyone. When you offered to buy Gustavo, it was perfect timing. I could eliminate a potential witness while giving Pablo someone to blame for the leaks." "So you told him about my meeting with Gustavo?" "I told him his cousin had been offered money and was considering it. Pablo did the rest himself." Her voice carried no remorse, only professional satisfaction. "Your guilt was so authentic, Carlos, so complete. You made the perfect distraction while I retired quietly to a very comfortable life." Carlos felt 30 years of anguish crystallize into pure rage. Elena died because she was getting close to the truth. Elena died because she couldn't leave well enough alone. Morrison's arrogance finally showed through her professional mask. Just like her father, some people don't understand when to stop digging. The admission hung between them like a confession. Morrison had spent decades eliminating witnesses, and Carlos, consumed by manufactured guilt, had provided the perfect cover. But her arrogance had just revealed something crucial. She thought she'd already won. She was about to learn how wrong she was. "You made one mistake," Carlos said quietly, his voice steady despite the rage burning in his chest. Morrison's eyebrow arched with amused curiosity. "Really? And what was that?" "You kept me alive too long." Carlos opened the folder deliberately, letting her see Elena's meticulous documentation. "You needed me guilty and broken, but you should have killed me the moment Pablo died. Because guilty men who think they're responsible for innocent deaths, they eventually start looking for ways to make amends." The first flicker of uncertainty crossed Morrison's face as she saw the bank statements, the hotel receipts, the phone records that Elena had preserved. But it was the cassette recorder that made her posture stiffen. "Elena found her father's insurance policy," Carlos continued. "Every conversation he had about Pablo's location, including his refusal of my money." He pressed play. and Gustavo's voice drifted across the ancient stones. "Where is safe for a man who betrays family? You think 30,000 buys a new life?" Morrison's professional mask began to crack. "That proves nothing." Pablo was paranoid. "It proves Gustavo never took the money, which means when you told Pablo his cousin was considering betrayal, you were manufacturing evidence. You needed Gustavo dead because he'd figured out you were the leak." Carlos stopped the recording, savoring the way Morrison's confidence wavered. "Elena documented everything. Your bank accounts in Panama, the timing of your retirement, even the safe house you've been using in Cartagena." "Elena is dead," Morrison said, but her voice carried less certainty now. "Elena was thorough." Carlos pulled out his phone, showing her a screen she couldn't quite read. "She set up insurance of her own, copies of everything, programmed to upload automatically if she didn't reset a digital timer every 72 hours. She died 4 days ago." Morrison's eyes widened as the implications hit her. If Elena's evidence was already in the hands of prosecutors, journalists, DEA Internal Affairs. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Carlos turned the phone so she could see the screen clearly. It showed an email composition window, subject line reading, "30 years of evidence, the real Pablo Escobar betrayal." The recipient list included names Morrison recognized: investigators, journalists, prosecutors who specialized in cartel cases. "Elena taught me about digital insurance policies before she died. Funny how guilty men become very motivated when they discover they've been protecting the real killer." Morrison reached into her purse with sudden urgency, but Carlos was ready. 30 years of guilt had made him careful, paranoid, prepared. His hand closed over hers before she could draw the small pistol hidden in the leather folds. "The beautiful thing about guilt," Carlos said, his grip tightening, "is that it makes men very, very patient. I've had 30 years to think about what I'd do if I ever found the person responsible for Gustavo's death. 30 years to plan. Carlos, listen to me." "I'm done listening." He twisted her wrist until she gasped, the gun falling to the stone walkway. "You killed Elena because she was close to the truth. You killed how many others? Ruiz? The witnesses who might have remembered your face from the old days?" Morrison's composure finally shattered completely. "You don't understand. Pablo would have killed us all eventually. I was protecting American operations." "You were protecting yourself." Carlos released her wrist but kept the gun, checking its safety with practiced familiarity. "And using my guilt as camouflage while you eliminated anyone who might remember Patricia Morrison, the DEA supervisor, who always seemed to know which raids would come up empty." The sunset painted the Caribbean in shades of blood and gold, and Carlos felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 decades, the satisfaction of truth finally spoken aloud. Morrison had orchestrated Gustavo's death to protect herself, then spent 30 years hiding behind Carlos's manufactured guilt while she eliminated witnesses. But her greatest mistake had been killing Elena, because Elena's death had finally given Carlos something more powerful than guilt: purpose. "The evidence uploads automatically in 6 hours, Carlos said, standing and backing away from the bench. "Unless I enter a cancellation code that Elena gave me before she died." "What do you want?" Morrison's voice cracked with desperation. "I want you to understand what 30 years of guilt feels like," Carlos replied. "I want you to spend your remaining hours knowing that your victims finally have a voice, and I want you to remember that the man you kept alive to cover your crimes is the one who's going to destroy you." Morrison lunged for him, but Carlos was already moving, 30 years of paranoia finally serving a purpose. The real confrontation was just beginning. She spun to face him, her professional mask completely shattered now, revealing something feral underneath. "You think you've won? You think uploading evidence will bring back Elena? Gustavo?" Her laugh was bitter, desperate. "You've spent 30 years running from ghosts, Carlos. What makes you think you can live with the truth?" "Because the truth isn't mine to carry anymore," Carlos replied, keeping the gun trained on her while maintaining careful distance. "I've been carrying your sins, Patricia, your betrayals, your murders, but guilt belongs to the person who actually committed the crimes." Morrison straightened her jacket with shaking hands, trying to reclaim some semblance of control. "The evidence won't stick. You think prosecutors will believe a story this complicated? A corrupt DEA supervisor, a 30-year cover-up, a guilt-ridden operative who fled to Colombia?" She smiled coldly. "I've had 3 decades to build my legend. Decorated agent, successful retirement, model citizen. Who's going to believe the word of a man who's been hiding in exile? Elena's evidence speaks for itself, Carlos said, but Morrison's confidence was returning, and that worried him. Elena's evidence proves Gustavo was innocent. It doesn't prove I was guilty. Morrison took a step closer, testing his resolve. Bank records from Panama, circumstantial. Retirement timing, coincidental. You need more than suspicious patterns to convict someone of treason and murder. Carlos felt a chill of recognition. She was right. Elena's meticulous documentation proved Gustavo's innocence, revealed the inconsistencies in the official story, but it didn't provide the smoking gun that would definitively identify Morrison as Pablo's source. After 30 years, witnesses were dead, records were lost, and Morrison had been very careful. But you made another mistake, Carlos said quietly. You came here tonight. Morrison's eyebrow arched. What do you mean? Carlos reached into his jacket pocket with his free hand, withdrawing a small device Elena had given him. Digital recorder, like her father's, but newer. Our entire conversation tonight, your confession to feeding Pablo information, your admission to killing Elena, your knowledge of details only the real betrayer would know. He held up the device, its red recording light blinking steadily. Funny how arrogant people always want to explain how clever they've been. The color drained from Morrison's face as she realized the trap she'd walked into. You son of a bitch. 30 years of guilt makes a man very thorough, Carlos replied. Elena taught me that evidence requires proof, not just suspicion. So thank you, Patricia, for giving me exactly what I needed. Morrison's composure cracked completely. She looked around desperately, at the ancient walls, the darkening sky, the gun in Carlos's steady hand. For the first time, she seemed to understand that her carefully constructed facade was crumbling. Carlos, listen to me. We can make a deal. I have money, connections. You want justice for Gustavo, for Elena? I can give you that, but this doesn't have to destroy both of us. You still don't understand, Carlos said, his voice heavy with 30 years of accumulated pain. This isn't about deals or money or even justice. This is about truth. For 3 decades, I've lived with the weight of an innocent man's death on my conscience. I've avoided mirrors, meaningful relationships, any kind of peace, because I believed I was responsible for Gustavo's murder. He took a step closer, his eyes locked on hers. But you know what I've learned tonight? Guilt is only unbearable when it's unearned, when it belongs to someone else, when it's real, when it's yours, it's just consequence. Morrison backed against the stone wall, her earlier predatory confidence completely evaporated. The upload timer, you can still cancel it. 6 hours, 5 hours and 43 minutes, Carlos corrected, glancing at his phone. But I'm not going to cancel anything. Elena died because you needed to protect your secret. Gustavo died because you needed a scapegoat. How many others died because you couldn't live with the consequences of your own choices? Carlos, please, no. His voice carried the finality of a man who had found his purpose after 30 years of wandering. You kept me alive because my guilt was useful. My suffering was your shield. But shields break, Patricia. And when they do, the person hiding behind them stands exposed. The gun felt steady in his hand as sirens wailed in the distance. Elena's insurance policy had included more than just evidence. It had included instructions for local authorities. Time to arrive precisely when Carlos needed them. Morrison heard the sirens too, her eyes widening with the realization that her carefully constructed life was ending against these ancient stones. This won't bring them back, she whispered. No, Carlos agreed, watching the police vehicles converge on their location. But it will finally let them rest. For the first time in 30 years, Carlos felt the weight of guilt lifting from his shoulders, not because the dead could be resurrected, but because their deaths would finally be attributed to the person who had actually caused them. The truth, he realized, was its own form of justice. 3 months later, he sat in the same spot. The cafe had been sold. Not out of necessity. Elena's final gift had included enough evidence of Morrison's stolen cartel money to ensure substantial restitution, but because Carlos could no longer bear the weight of performance. 30 years of playing the guilt-ridden exile had left him uncertain of who he actually was beneath the role. Morrison had been extradited to Miami, where prosecutors were building cases around multiple murders, treason, and conspiracy charges. The recording device had captured enough admissions to corroborate Elena's evidence, creating an unbreakable chain of proof. Carlos had testified via video link, his face finally shown to the world after 3 decades of hiding. He'd expected relief. Instead, he'd found something more complex, a profound emptiness where his defining guilt had once lived. "Señor Mendoza?" Carlos turned to find a young Colombian journalist approaching hesitantly, notebook in hand. These interviews had become routine since Morrison's arrest made international headlines. The story had everything: corruption, cartels, murder, and a 30-year conspiracy that had fooled both governments and criminal organizations. "I've read all the coverage," the journalist said, settling onto the bench with practiced casualness. "But I'm curious about something the other reporters haven't asked. How do you live with relief?" The question surprised Carlos with its insight. "What do you mean?" "Everyone wants to know about the guilt, the years of exile, the dramatic confrontation. But you were defined by that guilt for 3 decades. Now that it's gone, who are you?" Carlos considered this carefully. Since Morrison's arrest, he'd been drifting through days without the familiar anchor of self-recrimination. The guilt had been terrible, but it had also been constant, a reliable companion that had shaped every decision, every relationship, every quiet moment. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "When you believe you're responsible for an innocent man's death, it colors everything. Where you live, how you interact with people, whether you deserve happiness or peace. Remove that belief, and you discover you've forgotten who you might have been." The journalist scribbled notes. "Do you regret learning the truth?" "No." The answer came without hesitation. "Gustavo and Elena deserve justice, even delayed justice. But truth is more complicated than revelation. It doesn't automatically restore the years you lost to false belief." As the journalist gathered his materials and departed, Carlos remained on the bench, watching cruise ships navigate the distant harbor. Elena's funeral had been 3 weeks ago, a small ceremony attended by colleagues from her university and a few distant relatives who remembered her father fondly. Carlos had been the only person present who understood the true scope of what she'd accomplished. At the service, Elena's elderly aunt had approached him with a question that still echoed. She spent so many years researching her father's death. Did she find peace before the end? Carlos hoped so. Elena had died believing her father was innocent, carrying evidence that would eventually vindicate him. She'd never known about Morrison's manipulation, never experienced the crushing revelation that her lifetime of research had been built around a carefully constructed lie. Perhaps ignorance, in her case, had been mercy. His phone buzzed a text message from an unknown number. For a moment, his paranoia returned, 30 years of caution reasserting itself. Then he read the message and felt something unexpected: anticipation. "Mr. Mendoza, this is Sofia Restrepo from the Gustavo Restrepo Memorial Foundation. We're establishing a scholarship program for journalism students investigating historical injustices. Would you be interested in serving on our board?" Carlos stared at the message, understanding its implications. Elena's cousin had used the restitution money to create something constructive from tragedy. She was offering him purpose beyond his own healing, a chance to help other people uncover truths that powerful people preferred to keep buried. For 30 years he'd been running from a ghost. Perhaps it was time to honor that ghost instead. He typed back, "Yes, I'd be honored." As he stood to leave the Morales, Carlos realized he was no longer the man who'd arrived in Cartagena 15 years ago. That man had been broken, haunted, defined by manufactured guilt. But he wasn't yet sure who he was becoming. Walking through the narrow colonial streets toward his hotel, he passed the corner where his cafe had stood. The new owners had painted the walls bright yellow and installed cheerful awnings. It looked nothing like the refuge he'd created. For the first time since Morrison's arrest, Carlos smiled. He was finally free to discover who he might have been if he'd never carried someone else's sins.